Moscow's energy crisis is growing by the day. It is making great efforts to fill the gap created by the oil refineries that Ukraine has been attacking for weeks. People in large settlements such as Moscow, Smolensk and Saratov can now only buy 10 liters of gasoline per day. This situation is beginning to test the patience of the Russian people. However, Vladimir Putin's attempts to remedy the situation continue to fall flat. As a last resort to solve the fuel crisis, Putin placed his trust in Alexander Lukashenko. But once again, the mountains Putin trusted were covered in snow. The last hope fuel train that set off from Russia's ally Belarus never reached its destination. At a simple level crossing near Smolensk, it collided with a truck and, along with the millions of liters of gasoline it was carrying, turned into a huge fireball. This disaster is not just the loss of 12 tanker cars and their valuable cargo. It is proof that Putin's war machine can no longer sustain itself, that it cannot even perform the most basic logistical functions, and that the growing rebellion of the fuel-starved Russian people has become even more deadly than Ukrainian missiles. The Russian state media's attempt to present the incident as a simple truck collision at a level crossing and claim that there were no casualties cannot hide how shameful the truth is. This may be an accident, but the conditions that led to this accident show that the Russian state system as a whole has collapsed. Above all, this accident is a painful testament to the neglected and collapsing Russian domestic infrastructure, which has been deprived of resources due to the war. How else can one explain that the Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow railway line, which is of such strategic military importance in wartime, lacks even the most basic safety measures? Whether due to a malfunctioning level crossing signaling system, the absence of safety barriers, or the negligence of officials, this incident demonstrates that the state is unable to perform even its most basic function. The Kremlin can send hypersonic missiles to Ukraine, but it cannot safely pass the train carrying the fuel for those missiles through a simple level crossing on its own territory. This is a sign of complete incompetence for a modern state. Secondly, this incident has exposed how fragile Russia's logistics system is, and how dependent it is on a single route. This accident in Smolensk shut down the main railway line between Belarus and Russia for hours, even days. This halted not only fuel shipments, but also all military and civilian shipments passing through that line. This has painfully demonstrated that Russia's western logistics corridor is almost entirely dependent on a single country, namely Belarus, and that even the smallest disruption on this line, whether due to an accident or future partisan sabotage, could paralyze the entire front's supply capacity. Third, there is the military cost of the lost fuel. More than 12 derailed tanker cars mean hundreds of tons or millions of liters of gasoline. This amount means that thousands of military vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks on the front will be immobilized for days, perhaps weeks. For an army already suffering from fuel shortages, this is an operational disaster. It presents Ukrainian forces with an invaluable window of opportunity to launch new offensives, while their enemy has lost its mobility. To understand why this train is a last hope, we need to recall the events of recent months. Ukraine has made a revolutionary change in its war strategy, targeting Russia's greatest strength and, at the same time, its greatest weakness, its energy infrastructure. With a series of successful long-range drone attacks, more than 17% of Russia's oil refining capacity was destroyed or severely damaged. This was not just industrial damage, it was a dagger to the heart of the Russian economy. The result of these attacks was an unprecedented fuel crisis within the country. Russia, once an energy exporter to the world, became unable to supply gasoline and diesel to its own people and army. The government was forced to completely ban gasoline exports until March 2026 to get the situation under control. But even this was not enough. From Crimea to Rostov, in all regions close to the southern front, kilometer-long queues began to form at gas stations. Prices skyrocketed. The agricultural sector couldn't find the diesel fuel needed for harvesting, while logistics companies cancelled their shipments. Most critically, tanks, armored vehicles, and supply trucks at the front faced the risk of losing their mobility. It was in this moment of desperation that Putin was forced to knock on the door of his small ally Belarus, which he normally subsidizes economically. This was a humiliating situation for a country claiming to be a superpower. Lukashenko was asked to make emergency fuel deliveries to supply Russia's northern front and critical logistics centers such as Smolensk. That train burning in Smolensk was the very embodiment of this humiliating call for help, this lifeline. This train carried not only fuel, but also the Kremlin's dwindling hopes. Another consequence of this disaster, at least as significant as the material damage, is the heavy blow it dealt to Putin's "everything is under control" propaganda. This incident contains all the elements necessary for a montage of shame. On the one hand, there are the images of Putin and his generals in those grandiose gilded meeting rooms, talking about Russia's power, invincibility, and ability to overcome any challenge. On the other, the hellish flames in Smolensk, the wagons turned into piles of molten metal, the toxic black smoke covering the sky, and the images of helpless firefighters trying to extinguish the flames. This is the humiliation of a superpower being forced to beg for fuel from its small neighbor at its most critical moment. This is the tragedy of that brotherly assistance failing to reach its destination, destroyed by its own incompetence and decay. And most importantly, this is proof that the regime cannot even perform its most basic functions, that it cannot even fulfill its most fundamental responsibilities to its own people and its own army. Putin's last hope was destroyed by a truck driver at a broken level crossing. The propaganda itself burned and turned to ashes that night in Smolensk. The effects of this accident in Smolensk will be felt in the coming days and weeks, both on the front lines and within Russia itself, like a chain reaction. For Russian troops at the front, this means that the already existing fuel shortage will deepen and the operational tempo will come to a complete standstill. Commanders will be forced to order tank and armored vehicle crews to conserve fuel and avoid unnecessary movement. This means that an army will completely lose its initiative, becoming a static and defenseless target. For the civilian population within Russia, this disaster will further fuel fears that fuel will begin to be rationed. Queues at gas stations will grow longer, and black market prices will skyrocket. This situation will further increase the public's anger and frustration with the regime. There is also a cycle between market data and behavior on the ground. Quotas and queues reinforce the consumer's half-tank reflex. Drivers who normally fill up every 2 days come to the pump earlier and more often, worried that they might not find fuel. This inflates the station's hourly demand. If a new increase in wholesale prices is seen at the same time, the station's next shipment will be more expensive. If the retail margin cannot be maintained, sales will be reduced or prices will rise. In short, supply and demand shocks amplify each other. The way to break this vicious cycle is either to permanently reduce disruptions on the supply side or to send confidence signals that will counteract panic behavior on the demand side. However, as long as Ukraine's pace of attacks continues, the effect of confidence signals will be limited. On the policy front, competition authority and stock exchange rules are as important an issue as stock exchange sales norms and damper parameters. Starting in mid-August, technical adjustments to market trading rules and institutional meetings came to the fore. This alone does not lower prices. However, it reduces excessive volatility and narrows the scope for speculative behavior. The simultaneous shutdown of central production facilities such as Kirishi and Ryazan for more than 2 weeks, coupled with AI-92 reaching a new peak on Spymex, a 5 to 7 day delay in the wave of retail price increases, the visible reduction in routes and shifts in Moscow's internal distribution lines due to fuel availability in logistics, and finally, official signals of import support or extraordinary allocation. If 3 of these 4 occur simultaneously, it can be assumed that the fuel crisis has worsened. Now, let's answer the question: where does this squeeze the other gears of the economy from a broader perspective? Gasoline and diesel prices have a strong multiplier effect on the cost of living through food shelf and logistics costs in Russia, as they do in countries such as Turkey or the EU. During harvest season in rural areas, diesel restrictions slow down the pace of trucks and harvesters. In cities, delays in distribution networks increase perceived inflation. Even if consumers don't go directly to the pump, they feel the fuel premium in the market and in transportation. The permanence of this premium increases the burden on the budget. As budget pressure grows, savings or tax adjustments may be needed in other areas. This is why it is critical to view the fuel crisis not just as an energy issue, but also as a fiscal policy issue. For this reason, the effects of the train crash in Smolensk were not limited to the tragic image that lit up the sky at that moment. Those flames were the beginning of a multi-layered disaster that would be felt like a chain reaction in the coming days and weeks, both on the front lines in Ukraine and in every household within Russia itself. When news of the disaster reached the front lines via encrypted radio channels and telegram groups, its impact was far more devastating and lasting than the explosion of a cannonball. That train burning in Smolensk wasn't just carrying millions of liters of gasoline, it was also carrying the last hopes of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers waiting in the trenches on Ukraine's northern front, along the Kupiansk and Lyman lines. Imagine the commander of a Russian tank battalion on that front the morning after the crash. For months he had been struggling with that chronic fuel shortage that limited his unit's mobility and delayed operations. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, supply trucks, all were trying to survive on the last drops of diesel in their tanks. And that morning, that short, cold order from headquarters destroys all plans, all hopes. Fuel consumption in all units will be reduced to a minimum. Engines will not be started except in cases of mandatory attack or relocation until further notice. What does this simple military order mean in the reality on the ground? It means that those tanks are no longer offensive weapons. They have become static metal coffins, immobilized on their tracks. When detected by a Ukrainian UAV, they have no chance of survival by changing position. When a Ukrainian infantry unit attempts to flank them, they have lost the ability to maneuver against it. This means that the self-propelled howitzers and multiple rocket launcher systems like Grad, which form the backbone of the Russian army's artillery power, are silenced. The greatest advantage of these systems is that they can quickly relocate after firing to escape enemy counter-battery fire. Without fuel, this mobility is lost. Every time they fire, they dig their own graves, as they become stationary targets for Ukraine's precision strike systems. This means that logistics have completely ground to a halt. The Ural and Kamaz trucks that transport ammunition, food, water and medical supplies to soldiers on the front line cannot move without fuel in their tanks. This means that soldiers in the trenches must fight not only the enemy, but also hunger and thirst. And perhaps the most tragic consequence is that the evacuation of the wounded becomes impossible. The armored medical vehicles that would transport a soldier wounded by shrapnel to the nearest field hospital cannot leave their barracks because they have no fuel. This means that a wounded soldier, who could actually be saved, slowly bleeds to death in the trenches. The impact of the accident in Smolensk on the front line is total paralysis. This situation also destroys the psychology of the soldier in the trench. He now fears not only the enemy, but also the failure of his own system. He knows that when he is pinned down, the tanks will not come to his aid, the artillery will not protect him, and he will not be evacuated if wounded. This is a feeling of absolute abandonment that fundamentally destroys a soldier's will to fight. Those flames in Smolensk were actually a fire that burned the morale and operational capabilities of the Russian army on the northern front, and Ukrainian commanders had already begun planning to exploit this massive vulnerability, this spontaneously created window of opportunity, in the most ruthless way possible. While the front line struggled with this military paralysis, a very different but equally dangerous wave of panic was spreading among the civilian population within Russia itself. State media controlled by the Kremlin attempted to portray the incident in Smolensk as a minor accident or a simple collision caused by a careless truck driver. The media ran stories claiming there were no casualties, downplaying the incident. However, in the 21st century, especially in a country where everyone has a camera and internet in their pocket, it is now impossible to perpetuate such lies. Immediately after the crash, videos taken by witnesses showing the enormous inferno in all its nakedness spread like a virus on Telegram channels and other social media platforms. People noticed the huge gap between the minor accident story told by the state and the apocalyptic scene they saw with their own eyes. And this further fueled the already existing distrust and anger. This distrust instantly turned into panic. The question, if even the emergency aid train from Belarus ended up like this on the way, how will fuel get to our gas stations? Echoed in the minds of millions. The fuel shortage, which had already been going on for weeks due to Ukraine's attacks on refineries, turned into full-blown hysteria with this disaster. From Smolensk to Moscow, from Bryansk to Tver, people in all cities across Western Russia jumped into their cars and rushed to gas stations. Queues stretching for miles formed. Waiting for hours in these queues frayed people's nerves. Fights and brawls broke out among drivers. Before long, the station's tanks were empty, and the owners were forced to hang the infamous and frightening "No gasoline" sign on the pumps. This situation inevitably led to the emergence of a black market. Opportunists stockpiling gasoline in cans began selling fuel at 3 or even 4 times the official price. This was a disaster, especially for truck drivers who make their living from transportation, farmers, and millions of people living in rural areas who depend on their cars for transportation. This was not just a fuel crisis, but also a paralysis of the civilian economy. Crops could not be harvested from the fields, food could not be transported to markets, and people could not get to work. The Kremlin's response to the train accident was predictable. The solution was to blame the careless truck driver, make a few local railway officials scapegoats by firing them, But all these efforts did not solve the people's fundamental problem. The warehouses were empty, and the cars were not running. The Kremlin's incompetent and denialist attitude only served to further increase the people's anger and weariness with the regime. People began to realize that the problem was not a truck driver or a few local officials, but the system itself. A regime that spent billions of dollars on war while failing to meet even the most basic needs of its own people. This incident would also become a source of inspiration for resistance groups and partisans within Russia. If a simple accident could deal such a blow to Russian logistics, it was not difficult to imagine what a well-planned sabotage could do. Indeed, this accident was also noticed by the ATESH group, which was growing silently but steadily within Russia. For them, the Smolensk disaster was not just a news story, but an invaluable lesson and a new source of inspiration. These resistance fighters drew a vital lesson from this event. To collapse Russia's logistics system, there was no need for complex, high-risk and sophisticated bombing operations. The system was so rotten, so neglected, and so incompetently managed that sometimes even a simple accident could have more devastating consequences than the most successful sabotage operation. This disaster had once again laid bare the fragility and value of Russia's railway network as a target. This opened a new tactical door for the partisans. The goal could now be more than just blowing up the tracks with bombs. Much simpler, less risky, and harder to detect low-tech acts of sabotage could be just as effective. Locking a railroad switch, cutting the cables of a signal box, loosening the bolts on a bridge, or, as in Smolensk, organizing a deliberate accident at a level crossing where a critical shipment was to pass. All of these meant using the chaos and incompetence within the regime itself as a weapon. The fire in Smolensk thus became a proof of concept for resistance groups within Russia. This incident showed them that the regime's greatest enemy was the regime itself, and this knowledge gave them new courage and a new vision for the actions they would plan in the future. Their targets were now not only military convoys, but also the countless weak links that would trigger the regime's potential for self-destruction. Ultimately, the train crash in Smolensk was not just a simple accident or a logistical disaster. It is a perfect example of the systemic collapse feedback loop created by Putin's war. The external pressure created by the war triggers internal systemic weaknesses, such as outdated infrastructure, security vulnerabilities, and incompetence. These internal weaknesses turn attempts to respond to external pressure, such as bringing in fuel from Belarus, into a catastrophic failure, and this failure deepens the crisis both at the front and on the home front, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of disaster. Ultimately, it is self-inflicted damage that is as destructive as, if not more so than, the attacks on Ukraine. This is proof that Putin's war machine is now being destroyed, not only by Ukraine, but also by its own internal chaos and decay. That train burning in Smolensk was not just a fuel shipment, it was the funeral pyre of the Fortress Russia myth and Putin's illusion that everything is under control. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.